Good morning, everyone. I am Julie Landau. I'm a member of the Community Advisory Board for Genocide Awareness Week, and it's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Anna Hájková. Dr. Anna Hájková is an associate professor of modern European continental history at the University of Warwick in the United Kingdom. She's the author of The Last Ghetto, An Everyday History of Theresienstadt. The dissertation on which this is based was awarded both the Irma Rosenberg as well as the Herbert Steiner Prizes. Dr. Hájková is also the guest editor of the Holocaust, Sexuality, Stigma special issue of the Journal of German History. We are so lucky to have Dr. Hájková in the United States and here with us today. I am so excited to hear and learn more about the history of Theresienstadt. Please welcome Dr. Hájková.
Thank you so much, Julie, for this very kind introduction. I'm thrilled to be in Phoenix, and I want to continue in things to Anya Chichopek, to John Lifferton, and to Corey Montana for making my visit possible. So my book is doing two things. It offers a new history of Theresienstadt. All key previous histories were written by survivors, and obviously I am not a survivor, and it offers an analytical history of a camp society. One of chief aims of my book is to go beyond a Holocaust exceptionalist paradigm. I think everybody who is in the room is aware, and especially if you are scholars, you have experienced it, that our generalist colleagues will find our work interesting and terrible, but will not quite engage with it intellectually. And sometimes Holocaust historians also do not quite take on board larger theoretical insights. I mean, on the first point, I can say I'm just coming from Pittsburgh, and I did notice that a lot of Jewish history colleagues were in the room, but say the world history people and so on were not, which I thought was a bit disappointing because when, say, at Warwick, my world history colleagues give a talk or have someone come over, I'm not just interested in Europe, I'm interested in Japan and China and Africa as well. I have already announced that I'm a slightly pragmatical person, and Julie has encouraged me to do that. So if you want to buy my book, there is a number of options how you can do that. You can get a discount, and I'm a big fan of discounts. So you can order from OUP and get a 30% off. That has two disadvantages. First, OUP shipping, and I see from your facial expression that you're already looking just as displeased as I was when I found out. It will take 3 months until it arrives there. And the $10 discount is offset against about $7 of shipping. But it is very exciting to wait for 3 months until the book arrives. You can also get it as an ebook on Kindle or whatever your reading thing is for, I think, $10. Or I understand there is a great bookshop here in Phoenix or Tampa called Changing Hands. So I want to encourage everyone to support your local bookshops. The world would be a much sadder place without bookshops, and it's about $34. It's not too expensive. So now having advertised the book, I can go back to intellectual topic. And in the following about 35 minutes, I want to introduce some of the key themes of my book on prisoner society and agency, on food and starvation, on the transnational society in the camp, and on insights for Jewish history. But before I do so, I want to offer a short history of the ghetto. Theresienstadt was set up by the Nazis in November 1941 as a transit ghetto for Central European and Western European Jews, and was liberated one day after the end of the war on 9th of May 1945. So when I was looking for a good catchy title, I thought The Last Ghetto is completely accurate. It was indeed liberated one day after the end of the war. It is not Luch or Loch, but it is really Theresienstadt that is the last ghetto. But it is also makes it remarkable because it has such a long duration in 44, 45, when other ghettos have already been liquidated. In addition to Czech Jews who pretty much in their totality were sent here, also people from Germany, Austria, Denmark, Netherlands, Slovakia, and Hungary were deported here. Altogether, over 140,000 people. Everybody because they had some Jewish background, independently whether they self-defined as Jewish or not. And because the ghetto lasted until the end of the war, some 15,000 veterans stayed here until the liberation. And then just before the Russian army came, another 10 or 15,000 people came here on death marches. The SS ran the ghetto and controlled the ghetto, but did not actually administer it. And they were too smart to outsource the actual administration to Jewish functionaries who were forced to decide who is going to be accommodated where, how the food will be prepared and how it will be purchased. And most heartbreakingly, how will the transports that the Germans decide on be put together with actual names? And this is the case until almost the end of the transports, until the middle of October 1944. I have heard, as people are here, and I sometimes eavesdrop on people's conversations, that again, what Theresienstadt is best known for is kind of the propaganda aspect, the visit of the International Red Cross, or the propaganda movie shot in 1944. And these are really extraordinary aspects, but as I found out in my research, they influence relatively little about the everyday life in the ghetto and the things that people in the ghetto experience. And it is the social and cultural history of the imprisoned people that interested me. So people in Theresienstadt started a master narrative that to date kind of influences how people remember and depict Theresienstadt as a place where Jews marked as pariahs and kicked out from home showed that they can make out of a dilapidated place something good, something useful. And people who were always reproached for kind of being impractical intellectuals like lawyers and whatnot can work with their muscular arms and can set up these dilapidated barracks into something nice, can produce beautiful cultural events, and can take care of the weakest, and the weakest were defined as children. And this is not wrong. This is part of what Theresienstadt was, but it's also only part of the history, and some aspects are missing. One of the things that I always like sharing when I give a book talk is the two maps that are in the book. We all know that maps are an interpretation of history. They are not facts. And most of the maps that we have of Theresienstadt are based on the work of the Jewish cartographers who were prisoners in Theresienstadt. And my partner, who is an architect, wanted to participate in the book project, and she drew these maps. So we looked at a lot of maps from the 19th century, from 1930s, on the work of the Jewish cartographers that produce a number of maps. And on today's maps, we walked around the memorial, and I know that many of you will have visited. We took gazillions of pictures, and the maps are here. So even though my partner is not here today, I also always like to give her a shout out because it was a true labor of love. And now, having finished a little bit of a background, I want to move to the first topical point, namely to society. My book focuses on victims' history. It's a, I guess, classic example of Jewish Holocaust history. I do not focus on perpetrators, even though I also write about the perpetrators. I guess what makes my book special is that in observing the victim society outside the focus of the perpetrators and beyond a total focus on violence, and here I want to give a shout out to Anja Cichopek, where her study was a great inspiration for me. We recognize that violence is indeed important, but it's also not everywhere. In a way, it's a little bit like stuffing a dead goose. If you look for violence, you will find violence. I tried to work inductively. I tried to find what is out there. So, while conditions, hunger, plummeting mortality, and fear were created by Nazi persecution, the prisoner society was decisively not a Nazific creation. And I guess here comes one of my interventions into the field. In the last 10 years, Hannah Arendt has been having a revival, and I'm very happy that she's having a revival. She was a brilliant thinker. And in a way, what I say the following is thinking on the shoulders of giants. So our thinking about prisoner society, and especially totalitarian societies, is very much imprinted by Arendt's dictum that camps and totalitarian societies eventually destroy the social, that they atomize collectives into individuals. And this is not what I found out in my research. I find that the social continues until the very end, but I guess we need to recalibrate our perspective to understand how the social will work. So some of the things I pay attention to are human decision. That again goes to quite an important argument in Holocaust studies, whether Holocaust victims had agency, whether they had any meaningful agency, and in fact, whether it is ethical to ask whether they had any agency. And here I am in conversations with Lawrence Langer and his concept of choiceless choices. But I think we should actually take people's agency seriously, the decisions with whom to share the accommodation, because men and women were separated, to Jewish self-administration assigned people's rooms. And if you are going to live with your partner, with your parents, with your siblings, with the friends you made at work, at the forced labor that you are doing, or with the people who you met in your accommodation and who are your new best friends, this may appear to us boring because in the end, almost everybody is going to be slaughtered. But this was immensely important to the people in Theresienstadt and generally to Holocaust victims. Similarly, in the evening when you have time to eat food, because during the day you do forced labor, are you going to share it with your family? Are you going to share it with the men with who you fell in love in Theresienstadt? Are you going to share it with your resistance group? These are the decisions that create the social fabric, and these are some of the stories I share in my book. So I argue that the society in Theresienstadt was a society created and lived in extreme circumstances that had pronounced power asymmetries with lethal consequences. These social hierarchies took form in unjust and uneven allocation of resources. Prisoners communicated, formed groups, and created rules. And the examination of the society in Theresienstadt, and this is where my case study approach in the book comes through, helps us understand how people adapt and create the social in extremis. Good. I will now move to the second point, which is food. And I have already touched on kind of this agency or agentic moment in deciding with who to share the food. I guess I will now segue to another point that I wanted to share, because I got so carried away talking about agency that I gave away my earlier point about sharing food. And that is the somewhat more difficult topic to stomach, but I find immensely important as well, namely the question of hunger and starvation. So when I say that a lot of people were hungry in the Holocaust and that they died of starvation-related diseases, everybody will say, and so what? We knew that. But what I try to do in the book is to ask how it exactly plays out. Who are the people who do become hungry, and how does the remainder of the society react to the fact that a certain segment will be particularly hit by hunger? In order to understand how people were hungry in Theresienstadt and who was hungry, we need to pay attention to the fact that it was in May 1942 that the Jewish self-administration learns from the Nazis that soon German and Austrian Jews will start arriving. At this point, it is only the Czech Jews, and these will be the elderly. And 2 or 3 weeks before the German elderly start arriving, the Jewish functionaries in Theresienstadt decide that they will start a categorization of food, mainly in 3 categories: into the hard laborers, normal workers, and non-workers. People above 60 years of age, if they are women, and 65 if they are men, no longer have to work, and then they get non-worker portions. And then you have the normal workers, and people like, say, bakers or construction workers, or some of the leading physicians and nurses will be hard workers. The food rations and the calorical tables that survive to this day are not completely reliable, because the food was often stolen from, and then there was a myriad of ways how to kind of boost up your food intake. But what we know for sure is that the non-workers got the smallest food rations. Their food was also most often pilfered from by the cooks and people around the cooks. And also in terms of nutritionist gaze, their food was the least nutritious. Their food was almost only carbohydrates and some fats, almost no vitamins, almost no fiber, almost no protein, which led to quite outrageous and really strong mortality of the elderly. In fact, when you look at the people who die in Theresienstadt, 84% of the people who died in Theresienstadt were above 60 years of age, and 92% of the elderly who were in Theresienstadt died. And the diseases that they die from, and we know it from the diaries and from the letters and from the early post-war testimonies, are heart attack and enteritis. Enteritis is an infectious disease. I guess many of us have that and just don't speak about it because it's impolite to speak. But the diarrhea and the palpitations we have when we have novovirus and whatnot is much more deadly if you are in the ghetto, if you cannot wash, if you cannot get electrolytes, and especially if you are 80 or 85 years of age. So for the old people, and this is the whole founding generation of Central European Jewry, as we know it from the work of, say, David Tolkien or Maren Kaplan, these are the conditions how tens of thousands Czech, Austrian, and German elderly die in their own dirt, in their own feces on the attics of the big Theresienstadt barracks. On the other end, I guess our imagined social hierarchy of Theresienstadt is the golden Czech youth, the Zlatá mládež. They, in fact, even use the term Jeunesse dorée, kind of citing the 1920s and the Roaring 20s. And here I want to share with you this completely fascinating drawing by Elie Lesclý, before the war, Erich Lichtblau, who was actually not a professional painter. He was kind of a hobby painter, but he did these absolutely amazing drawings already in Theresienstadt. And after he survived, he first changed his name to less German-sounding Elie Lesclý, and then he emigrated with this very Czech name to a kibbutz in Israel, where he lived for many, many years. And at some point in the 1970s, he sat down. I think there are people trying to get in. He sat down and redrew the pictures, but this one is a historical original. And a kind of a graphic novel style, he offers a very sober outlook on the social in Theresienstadt. And he shows the three magi, the tři králové, you know, the guys who come to baby Jesus on 6th of January. And the three magi is the pastry baker, the baker, and the cook, because these are the big bosses in Theresienstadt. So when we look at some of the testimonies that we know from Theresienstadt about Brundi bar and about staging arts and about soccer playing and whatnot, these are experiences of a certain segment of the Theresienstadt society. And the opposite of that, I always find so telling, this drawing of the Brno architect Norbert Trolla, who drew prošlupky for the peels, a group of elderly picking up in the rubbish to get something edible, the potato peels. And he doesn't depict them in opposite to Lesclý's drawing before as individuals. You just see the body forms. And when we kind of look at the testimonies of the younger Czech Jews, how they describe the elderly, it is usually this story. There were these frustrating German elderly, and they bothered us asking if we will give them the leftovers. And I guess sometimes it's worth also asking, how was the sentence spoken? Because here are the very dignified Berlin and Munich and Nuremberg and Viennese people who used to go to the opera and who used to subscribe to Berliner Tagblatt and who were all their lives endeavoring to be decent and to be polite. And now they are really struggling to stay alive, and it's worse for them to look for dirty potato peels and to ask the Czech social elite for some of their soup. The combination of the smooth food rations, bad accommodation, untreated enteritis translated into skyrocketing high mortality of the elderly. And I have already given you the statistics. The following quote by Karl Löwenstein, the head of the ghetto guard, kind of gives a good example how these people died and how their bodies looked like. He visited the pathology and was shocked. I quote, "The corpses of those who died, whom I got to see here, were only bones covered by skin. These dead literally starved to death. I saw corpses who were not heavier than a small child." End of quote. And when then Löwenstein asked the head pathologist, who, by the way, it's very interesting, you have three women in leading medical positions in Theresienstadt, and Irma Goldman is the woman who headed pathology. And Goldman tells him, but this is how the dead people who die are developed to pathology. They are 30 kilo heavy, and they're just bones covered by the skin. And these are tough facts to stomach. And I do want to make absolutely clear, I'm not making a statement in blaming the victim community. What we have at hand is a situation that is best described by Amartya Sen's study of famines. In situations of shortage, many more people die than would be proportionately to the food missing. It was the German authorities who first deported Jews to Terezin and then severely limited to food supplies. Yet how then the misdistribution will play out always depends on the social setting. And in Theresienstadt, where the elderly were already negotiated on the bottom of the social hierarchy, are then the people who get the least of food. And they die pretty much forgotten. They die as the frustrating elderly who begged for food. Or if you look at the testimonies of the Czech youngsters, something like a pak babička umřela, and then granny died. That's all you find out about the grandmother. And what I want to suggest is to incorporate the perspectives and the experience into the story of Theresienstadt and dare to look how these people die and make it into our history and not to erase them further. Food also was a means of a new culture in Theresienstadt. We will know from the feminist scholarship like Cara de Silva in Memory's Kitchen how women, both younger and older, like to swap recipes about the foods they used to cook at home. The recipes are interesting because they tend to be a little bit more posh, so they would be using more eggs and more butter and better chocolate and whatnot. But Theresienstadt also introduced people, and often they used to come from middle and upper middle class. So they would be eating pineapples, or they would be eating goose liver, the expensive good dishes. And then in Theresienstadt, the expensive good dishes are plums or cucumbers or tomatoes that people who work in forced labor for the SS in the agriculture somehow managed to smuggle in. And now people are salivating over a plum that before would be food of the poor people. For example, Richard Ehrlich, who was a 55-year-old man from Berlin, was quite thrilled about millet and said, I quote, "I only discovered millet here and I could eat it every day," end of quote. One more point. Food is also quite a good way of understanding the fabric of the social, both in giving and in receiving. So when a man would be wooing a woman, he would offer her food. When they then become an item, she provides for him, because this is how you can express kinship. You can also express prestige and status. Else Dormitzer was a former eminent member of the Nuremberg Jewish community, and she escaped to the Netherlands, was deported via Westerbork to Theresienstadt. And when she was deported to Theresienstadt, her old acquaintance Leo Beck, the revered head of the Reform community in Germany, heard that the famous Else Dormitzer, if we follow Else Dormitzer, was deported to Theresienstadt. And this a sign of respect, he signed her raisin bread. And you will say raisin bread, I can go to the next best bakery and get a raisin bun. But in Theresienstadt, it's something extremely special. And for Leo Beck, it's a way of showing that he recognizes her as important. And it is so important to Else Dormitzer that she recalled so much in her testimony after the war. So one of the things that I think are worth doing about this cultural history of the Holocaust is to think about the meanings of these small everyday gestures, because they're quite political. And I will go on to transnational society. The mix of inmates in Terezin reflected the heterogeneity of the Jews in pre-war Europe. The ghetto inhabitants, I was quite amused to find out, included one magician, citizens of various South American countries, some of whom had passports who were quite genuine, some of whom had passports who were a little bit less genuine, people from Turkey and Soviet Union, 3 French Jews, that was the family of the former minister Leon Meyer, who were noticeable by the Stars of David with the inscription Juif, and not like the Dutch Jews Jod or the Czech and German and Austrian Jews with Jude. And in addition to the sizable Catholic and Protestant minority, there were 12 Adventists, 4 Christian Scientists, and 3 Muslims, tells us the Catholic community in Theresienstadt. But while people in Theresienstadt came from a number of countries, 6, and spoke at least 6 languages, what developed in Theresienstadt was a kind of a binary. And I thought about that a lot, because I thought the society in Theresienstadt, in their thinking about ethnicity and transnationality, would be much more differentiated. But no, what really permeates throughout Theresienstadt is a binary between the locals and the strangers, between the Czech Jews, who are seen as they belong here, and everybody who came abroad. And you see it, of course, very much with the testimonies of the Czech Jews, but you find it, I guess, a little bit puzzlingly in the testimonies of people from Berlin, from Slovakia and elsewhere, that they kind of accept that, yes, they are local, and yes, we are from abroad. And this binary thinking, I guess, also tells us something anthropological about how people who have a lot of differences at hand will then operate with a binary and create a binary out of nothing, which kind of leads me to a Jewish history point, which will be my last one. Because even though the society in Theresienstadt was really segmented, and if you were a poor German Jew living in an attic and a lot of your friends died and you really struggled to get treatment in the hospital, and if you were a well-liked Czech girl with a boyfriend who played in the soccer league and was able to work in the agriculture and could bring in the tomatoes, you are in a completely different setting. Or you can be a 50-year-old Moravian woman with 2 little children who does not have time to see any cultural events because, you have to wash the laundry for the little children. When you have spare time, you go visit them. You have to provide for your older relatives and so on. So you have all of these little bubbles, we could say today, and yet they're completely interconnected. So you have never more what the sociologists like to call 3 or 4 levels of distancing, because people in your accommodation will have networks. You will meet new people at your job place, and you will meet people also in the line for food. And people constantly get to know new people, and it also depends on their social capital if they can make, if you so want, a career. The social capital, I mean, how well-liked people are, how charming they are, how many new languages can they pick up, if they are seen as attractive, and so on. And it's quite interesting how in the diaries of the older German Jews, they start picking up Czech. I was never quite able to figure out if they do it deliberately or if it just kind of weaves into their language and they start saying polička instead of shelf, or if they write to their children, they sign this maminka instead of mother. But, the fact that Austrian Jews, people from Vienna, could speak Czech is not so surprising, because if you really look at where they came from, they often had Czech servants, or they came from Ungarisch Gradeš, from Uherské Hradiště, and so on. And we know from work of people like Georg Kaguš and others that this was a much more multilingual society. But people from Berlin and Hamburg, for them, Czechoslovakia was the place where you go to Karlsbad. And in Karlsbad, you don't really need to speak Czech. So this is really one of the points how we should understand the transnational that concentration camps were. And far too long, Holocaust history has been written as national history, as German or Polish or Zionist and whatnot. But the camps created a coerced society. I'm not advertising here, bringing people to a prison. But in order to understand the society that emerged here, we need to take transnational history very seriously. Good. I promised you Jewish history point, and now it comes. There's much debate in Jewish studies, especially in German Jewish history, what to make the concept of assimilation. If it's not like a little bit inaccurate, if it's not judgmental, if you should not be talking about acculturation and so on. And my studies of Theresienstadt show and bring me to the discussion to say we should actually take assimilation very seriously, not only for Czech Jews, but pretty much for everyone, because imprisonment in Theresienstadt showed to these people both in terms of emotional bonds, but especially in terms of habitus, the way how they reacted to imprisonment and the bonds they created, how immensely influential were the people, places where they came from. So I want to show it a little bit on the example of the Czech Jews, because when we look at the contemporaneous self-testimonies of the Czech Jews, there are so many and so very emotional relations to home. And I want to share with you the cover of one of the samizdat magazines made in the children's homes. You will, I guess the best well-known is Vedem, but there were dozens of those. And Bonako is an abbreviation for Bordel na kolečkách, or a mess on wheels. It was one of the homes in L414 for mixed-race girls. If you were in the protectorate 14 and your parents were mixed marriage and you were a member of the Jewish community, the special gift you got for your 14th birthday was the deportation to Theresienstadt without your parents, because your Jewish parent would be protected by the mixed race marriage. Mixed marriages were only deported to Theresienstadt from January to March 1945. So as a 14-year-old, you were deported on your own, and the self-administration was quite aware of how profoundly traumatizing it was for the young people, for the teenagers, and they set up a youth home specifically for them, and they picked particularly good madrechim or youth care workers to help for them. So one of my, I guess, protagonists, if not to say heroines, Gertruda Sekaninová-Chakatová, after the war, one of the Jews in kind of the government, and also the only one who survived Slansky trials in function, headed the L414 for girls. And on the cover of the magazine, you have a tree house on a little leg, and the sign on it says to Prague, to Prahy. But you could say, okay, these are mixed race kids. Of course, they have a Heimweh, they are homesick for home. But this is just one of the many, many other images. You will even see it in some ways in the referrals of the Zionist movement in Theresienstadt. There were also many other evocations of all sorts of Czech rituals and symbols. For instance, several inmates cut little wood lions, and that were very popular. And in particular, the double-tailed lion as the Czech coat of arms. People were singing songs of Voskovec and Werich of the so-called Liberated Theater. And Liberated Theater was this kind of lefty anti-fascist theater in Prague of the 1930s, 1920s. The coding of the theater as a leftist and anti-fascist and anti-capitalist, however, changed in imprisonment in Theresienstadt, because now it was not necessarily seen as political, but as Czech. And you see how people pick and choose certain symbols and own with new meaning. So Voskovec and Werich definitively changed. At the first Christmas in Terezín 1941, people read out aloud from the Bible of Kralice, which was the 16th century translation by the Bohemian Brethren that is quite well known in the Czech context for being particularly anti-Habsburg and pro-Masaryk Czechoslovakia. Reading in the Bible of Kralice placed the ghetto into the context of the Czech national struggle of the 19th century of trying to become independent from Habsburg. Most Czech Jews in Terezín celebrated Christmas, Easter, and St. Nicholas Day. And on the last one, Czech children walked around dressed like St. Nicholas with the Star of David placed on the Nicholas hat. The point here is not necessarily that they were bad Jews. They also celebrated Yom Kippur and Purim and Passover, although Purim is a difficult story. But the point is that the Christian holidays, or what we would read today in 2022 as Christian holidays, were incredibly emotionally coded as kind of a place of home. And this is why they celebrated it. In fact, sometimes when I kind of try to explain Czech Jews to British or American context, I say nobody loves Czech Christmas as much as Czech Jews. Another example that is a little bit more ambivalent is that of Bohumil Benda and his parents. So his parents had a kosher butcher shop in Pařížská. Pařížská is the big Ládnovo street that goes from Vltava, from the Moldau River to Old Town Square. And at the corner of Široká and Pařížská, today I think Christian Dior has a boutique there, used to be this butcher and charcutier. And this kosher charcutier had 3 children, Ludmila, Růžena, and Bohumil. Now, those of you who understand some Czech will know that a lot of Czech Jewish parents gave children names that could be easily translated. So, okay, Růžena couldn't be very easily Rose, so that's fine. Then you can have Bohumil, that is Gottfried, also easy to translate. But Ludmila you cannot translate. This is just a very hardcore Czech statement. The 2 girls married gentlemen. And what happened then with them is kind of part of the story I tell in the book. Bohumil was engaged to a Gentile woman, but they did not get married, and he was deported to Theresienstadt. In Theresienstadt, he became head of the butchers. And we know from a number of testimonies that he engaged in corruption. He stole meat in the conditions that I've described before, where people are dying of hunger, and not only sold it in the ghetto, he sold it to the outside, because selling meat outside brought him palpable money, brought him in particular gold, and he sent the gold to his Gentile fiancée to Prague. But of course, the prices for meat to the outside were much lower than he would been able to get in Theresienstadt. And with that, he severely limited the food that was available in Theresienstadt. That was not enough. Eventually, the scandal became out there. He was sent to Auschwitz, from Auschwitz to Kaufering, where he perished. And we are not able to find out who was the Gentile fiancé, and this is where these traces end. I do not tell the story to say that Bohumil Benda was a bad man. I think this kind of oversimplifies the matter, but reminds us how the society in the camps look like, and also how the Czech Jewish history played out. And you can see it in the little imprints of the names of the kosher charcutier who also perished in Holocaust. Beyond the simple layer of Czech Jews were indeed assimilated, and here are confirmed findings of, say, Tatiana Lichtenstein and others. There was also the layer how imprisonment strengthened the habitus of people. In the imprisonment, Czech Jews from Germany, Netherlands, and Czechoslovakia found out how much they shared with the place from where they were expelled, and that Theresienstadt, in fact, intensified these ties. While everyone in Theresienstadt was deported here because they were Jewish, the imprisonment did not engender a common sense of Jewishness. This was a matter about which the prisoners often had some thoughts on, especially the older people have spent their lives, and this is kind of the classical generation about whom I spoke, who often also perishes in Theresienstadt. So these older people kind of spent their lifetimes trying to be extra decent, to be extra anständig, and to show to anti-Semites that anti-Semites are wrong and that Jews are decent people who do not give any cause for anti-Semitism. I mean, of course, this is a false fallacy. But once they are deported to Theresienstadt, they obsess up to a point if something bad will not happen, because after all, maybe the anti-Semites were right and maybe Jews are bad people and now it will be horrible. And they are relieved to find out that they behave just like people, that Theresienstadt at the end of the day made them human and not Jewish. And there is this beautiful quote by the high school teacher Artur Polák, who used to teach at the elite high school in Štěpánská, in Stefansgasse. And he said, "Our people are the salt of the earth, but so much salt at once," end of quote. Jewishness turned out to be a divisive and not a bonding factor, indicating, like any other ethnicity, that nationality is constructed. Inmates were shaped by the countries they considered home. Jewishness was always a strategy of demarcation. The Czech, German, and so on prisoners considered themselves Jewish in the correct way, while they ascribe Jewishness to the others to depict them as other, as too assimilated or too orthodox. And most importantly, Theresienstadt did not engender a common Jewishness. The bonding factor for everyone was the master narrative about being in Theresienstadt and what it means, and the stories about beautiful cultural events and taking care of the children and so on, but not Jewishness. And I think this is a key contribution to the Holocaust as a part of the Jewish and European history. And in fact, these findings correspond directly with what Isaac Deutsche has written about non-Jewish Jewish history. If you look for the Jewish in Jewish history, we will find it. If you look how Jewish history plays out, it can be all kind of salience of Jewish. And I find it very inspiring and also very human. So to come to the end, how can we write a history of society in extremis? Suffering did not heroize people. Ghetto residents were not heroic when they listened to music, nor were they monsters when they denounced others to the SS. Such judgments obstruct more pertinent questions. Why did they act this way? What does it reveal about a society? I do want to put out there, and this is also why I like sharing the dedication of the book, namely to those people who did not return. I always bear in mind that I write about people who were slaughtered. The majority of the people I write about, including Bohumil Benda, were murdered like cattle, and they did not deserve that. And that is the beginning, and that is the end. And therefore, the task of a Holocaust historian is to apply systematic, unsentimental analysis together with empathy, indeed radical empathy, listening to a kaleidoscope of voices, always asking, what are the stories that we were not told? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I believe we have a time for a few questions. If anyone here in the room or online has any questions.
Thank you so much, Anna. And I loved your book. And this is just a snapshot of what your contribution, which is really important for Jewish studies, Holocaust studies, European history. You didn't have a chance to speak about love, relationship, and gender. And I know that this is something that you are very interested in. Could you tell us?
Of course. I mean, in a way, it was there because Bohumil Benda did not send out the meat just for no reason. He wanted to provide for the woman he loved. Yes. I think building on the work of Beate Meyer and Regina Milhoys and others, historians need to think about emotions, and we need to think about love. And how can we historicize love? The fact that you have a poor German girl from Hamburg who meets in the line for food the Czech cook, and he hits on her and they start going out. He helps her, she learns Czech, she gets to see Brundiba, she's part of all of that. Eventually he perished. She made a new way in America. When I met her in 2012, Esther Jonas looked at me and said, Veverka, that's skvělé in Czech. And she spoke with great love about her bygone boyfriend, but she was also aware that a very powerful motivator for her to love him was the fact that he was a cook and she had a very hungry family. And to have all of these aspects there also reminds us of the social networks in which we live, where we are encouraged to see the romantic in our life, but we also fall in love pragmatically and we stay in relationships pragmatically. And I think we have had a lot of debates about that, first during Trump, that we love our relatives who vote for Trump, and then during the pandemic where we live with people whom we love, but they also get on our nerves a lot, but it's the pandemic and we cannot move away. I think to think about what makes us human alongside ethnicity and class and violence and all of these things, and what are the relationships that last and how people make these claims, that's something I try to contribute to. And I can, of course, just say only so much, Anya, in my answer, but I guess I want to segue here the directions that I'm thinking on and where I would love to see more work, not by myself, by others in the future.
I don't really have a question. I'm just sharing with you because in America, it just seems like we're at the point where most Jews are greatly assimilated. And I'm just sharing with you some of the best Christmas songs were written by Jewish people. And my in-laws who were Jewish, I'm from mixed background, but my in-laws greatly appreciated the fact when they were invited to Christmas parties, and they felt it was a step towards normalization, and they really appreciated it. So that's just an American thing.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it because I'm a sucker for Christmas, and I come from Jewish background, and my partner who comes from a Gentile background says, we have this debate every 15th of December where she's like, let's skip Christmas and just do nothing. And I'm like, we are not skipping Christmas over our dead body. And then I go and take out Ottolenghi's cookbook and make his duvshany or make his spice cookies. But at the same time, it has happened to me a number of times, and I'm sure there will be more experiences that somebody at a journal or at a publisher proofreads my work and finds dimensions of bacon or of pathology of Christmases and says into the comment bubble, are you sure you not mistranslated? Of course they did not eat bacon. Bacon is trefe. I'm quite aware of the dietary laws, but we should not make in retrospect the Czech Jews or the Theresienstadt Jews different from what they were. But that is also not the point for me to look then at Warsaw or Białystok and say something was wrong with them. The Jewish experience is incredibly heterogeneous. Almost all of these people were erased by the Nazis. We as historians have these puzzle pieces, and it's our job to put the heterogeneity back. So I absolutely am the first one to subjectively say yay to Christmas, but also I don't want to get into the situation of, say, my late grandfather, who being reared as a very Czech assimilated Jew, had some very uncomfortable opinions about Orthodox Jews. And this all is part of the Jewish history. It all should be analyzed and I guess also celebrated. Thank you.
Professor, I really enjoyed your talk, and I'm going to download your book and read it on the plane on the way home today. And I really appreciate it because I, like many people, only know about Theresienstadt from the art and the children, and I feel like I always feel like, am I doing what the Nazis wanted, which is focusing on that part. And so your cultural history is amazing. I want to ask maybe a politically incorrect question, but it's not meant to be. But when I think about gender and food in camp settings around the world, it invariably gets to questions of sex work and sexual favors for food. And I'm not asking from a voyeuristic perspective, but did you find evidence of that? And how is that covered in diaries and testimonies?
Yeah, thank you so much. This is not an incorrect question. In fact, this is the most feminist of questions. In fact, if you want to look at the differences between third and second wave feminism, we have three. I mean, you are nodding, so I don't want to mansplain, but maybe for other people in the audience, and I often explain it to my students, it's pornography, it's sex work, and it's trans rights. And especially in the UK, we have some very, very bitter debates about these three. And I feel very keenly about two of them. Pornography is not my cup of tea, but there's other feminists who work on that. I will now boast a little bit. My claim to fame is that I wrote an essay, which was, I guess, the first essay to theorize sex work in the Holocaust about prostitution. It's called Sexual Barter in the Age of Genocide. And I think it's on JSTOR, free to download. And if you can't get it, just email me. And I've there lots of sources. And I even have images with women without the top covered. Anya is my witness. You are my witness. It's good for teaching the piece. Well, you know, I feel like I wrote the essay in 2000, or the piece came out in 2013. And I guess the most important claim I show here is to see sex work as a resource. As something that is strangely seen as something that has a lot of value. And it's something I was talking with Anya just yesterday. The fact that everybody's starving and people offer attention or affection or emotional support or all kinds of sexual services, and that it's forced to people to exchange food for that, is quite a different take on how to think about the worth and the value of sexual services. Something similar applies for hiding too. The debates we have been having in feminist Holocaust history have been, let's say, very emotional about the topic. And I fully expect that now with the Ukrainian war and the horrifying stories about gang rapes and so on, this will continue. It will continue to be uncomfortable. And I always kind of relate there to the work of Regina Mühlhäuser and others. But as these situations start to normalize, as it is not the first 2-3 months, but it lasts for years, you will have moments where it will still be sexual violence, but there will be aspects of barter. In rape, you do not have any moment of agency. In sexual barter, you do. And then it kind of irked me when I felt, I guess the article was not quite accepted elsewhere as I wish it had been. And as I guess that was also my earlier point about a certain theory shyness in Holocaust studies, where otherwise in wider history, Judy Volkowitz and her thinking about sex work as work has been incredibly influential. So I wrote another essay about sex work and Holocaust that it just came out in European Review of History. So I can also send you that. Also, I think it was flying, but I stopped hearing in one ear. So maybe one more question, and then I need to do some breathing so that I hear.
I just wanted to ask if you could just speak about, I'm under the impression that you said the Jews ran the camp and made the decisions of who got sent to Auschwitz or got sent out. How did they handle the people that were like the bakers and the cooks? Were they stable and they were there the longest, or did they get sent out too?
Yeah, Julie, this is absolutely accurate question. Okay, I think the ear is working again, which improves my well-being greatly. So it's the first chapter, the 6th chapter, in which I discuss exactly these questions, if you want to get the book and read the details. But definitely the people who stay the longest in Theresienstadt are either people who do work for the Nazis, who are seen as important but not too exposed, say the gardeners or people in the electrical factory and so on. But up to October 44, the people who stay there are people who are seen as the most indispensable. And in fact, every department ranks people according to their indispensability. And this is also the language they are using. In a way, the argument I'm doing for Jewish bureaucracy, and I build there on the work of Dan Dinner and Bate Maya and Doron Rabinovich, is that for administrators and bureaucrats, Theresienstadt and by extension, the Holocaust creates a bureaucratic problem, and they believe they can administrate it away. Yeah, they see it like as a physician looks at a leg and sees an illness, they look at the ghetto and they see an administrative problem. And the tragic is that they think that they can solve it. And they never believe that the Nazis are out to kill them all, because it does not logically make sense. And this is where I kind of built on the Dandina argument. So they think there is a way to do the transport list fairly and to create transports that will leave with medical provisions, with a physician, with a nurse, and with people who go together with their core kinship unit. Then when the Nazis start setting the transports, they just pick people on the street and send them to Auschwitz, because the Nazis know they're going to their death. But it's so emotionally important for people when they go on transport, that they go with their nearest ones, that they go within the kinship unit, whether it's the resistance group, whether it's their lovers, whether it's their parents, whether it's their best friends. And we see that also from the surviving collection of petitions to be taken out of transport or to be put on transport with whom people volunteer.
Right. Thank you so much. I just wanted to say that I agree this was just so fascinating and such a fabulous lecture. I'm definitely getting the book. I have a lot more questions, and I know the book will give me a lot more insight into Theresienstadt and the people's lives. And thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Okay.